Get out of here, Kamani. I don't want to see your face here when I wake up!
You didn't have time to shower before coming home?
Say what you need to say.
I need someone who's going somewhere. Not someone who comes home smelling like a loading dock every night.
She thinks she just threw out a warehouse worker who never mattered. She has no idea what just walked off that porch, soaked to the bone, carrying a secret worth more than everything she just kept for herself. My name is Kamani Reed. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed one simple thing. If you work hard enough and love hard enough, it will be enough. That night, standing in the rain on a porch in Mount Airy, Philadelphia, I found out how wrong I was. Take your bag and go, Kamani. I don't want to see you here when I wake up. Those were the last words my wife said to me before the deadbolt clicked shut behind her. A small, sharp sound that somehow felt louder than the thunder rolling over Chestnut Hill Avenue. But here's the part Yetunde didn't know, the part nobody knew. Tucked inside the one suitcase I carried down those porch steps was a leather notebook, soaked at the corners, with a name written on the inside cover in my own handwriting. Reed Legacy Holdings. She thought she was throwing away a warehouse worker who never made enough money to matter. She had no idea what she was actually letting walk out that door. Before we get into the story, I want you to remember this. Sometimes the biggest mistake a person makes isn't the affair, or the lie, or the cruelty. Sometimes it's simply underestimating the quiet man standing in the rain. 3 hours earlier, the house on that same street had smelled like rosemary chicken and candle wax. It was our 5th anniversary. I'd come home early from my shift at the distribution center near the port, still in my work boots, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. A silver bracelet I'd been paying off for 2 months, $10 at a time, hidden in the glove compartment of my truck so Yetunde wouldn't find it early. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, phone in one hand, wine glass in the other, laughing at something on the screen. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her eyes moved from my dusty jacket to the grease still on my knuckles, and something in her face folded. Not into love, but into something closer to embarrassment. "You didn't have time to shower before coming home?" she said, half a joke, half not. I let it go. I always let it go. 5 years of marriage had taught me that some battles weren't worth fighting after a 12-hour shift. We sat down to dinner. Candles. Her mother's old china. For a moment, it almost felt like the early days, back when we were two broke 20-somethings splitting a one-bedroom apartment in North Philadelphia, dreaming out loud about a life we hadn't built yet. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, smiled at the screen the way she used to smile at me, and set it face down a little too quickly. I didn't ask who it was. I already had a good idea. That was the thing about Yetunde. She thought silence meant I didn't notice. She thought a warehouse shift and a quiet nature meant I wasn't paying attention to the late nights, the sudden trips to visit her cousin in Rittenhouse Square, the new perfume that wasn't the one I'd bought her for Christmas. I noticed everything. I simply chose, for a long time, not to say anything. There had been a time when her silence felt like closeness. Quiet evenings on the stoop, her head on my shoulder, no phone between us. I used to think that girl was still in there, waiting for a version of me sure enough to bring her back out. After dinner, she poured a second glass of wine and finally said what she'd clearly been building up to all evening.
Kamani, I think we want different things. I think it's time we're honest about that.
I set my fork down slowly. Outside, the first low rumble of thunder rolled in over the ridge. "Different things," I repeated. Not a question, just letting the words sit in the air between us, the way you let a stone sit at the bottom of still water.
I need more.
She said.
I need someone who's going somewhere, not someone who comes home smelling like a loading dock every night.
I looked at her for a long moment. In 5 years, I had never once raised my voice at this woman. I wasn't about to start now, not when the rain outside was already starting to hit the windows in long, slow streaks. Not when there was a version of tonight I had quietly been preparing for since long before she ever said a word. Say what you need to say, I told her. And she did. She told me to pack a bag. She told me the house my overtime and my double shifts had helped pay down, was hers now, at least until the lawyers sorted it out. She told me I had 30 minutes. I didn't argue. I walked upstairs and packed one suitcase. My hands moved on instinct. Shirts folded the way my grandmother taught me, boots wrapped in a plastic bag so they wouldn't dampen the rest. At the bottom of the closet, my fingers brushed the edge of something I didn't reach for yet. Not tonight. Tonight was for leaving quietly. I came back down to find her standing by the door already, arms crossed, jaw set, like a woman rehearsing a role she'd been preparing to play for a while. I stepped past her onto the porch. The rain had picked up, cold and steady, running down the collar of my jacket. "Kimani," she said, just once, almost soft, almost like she wanted me to fight for it. I didn't turn around, because what Yetunde Reed did not know, what she would not find out for another 3 months, was that the man walking away from her that night in the rain wasn't losing everything. He was finally free to become who he'd already quietly built himself into. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you the most, stay with me. This story is for you. 2 weeks after that night in the rain, I was living in a one-room apartment above a laundromat on Germantown Avenue in North Philadelphia. The radiator clanked at 3 in the morning like it had something to say. The window didn't quite close all the way, so in October, the cold came in anyway, slow and patient, the same way regret does. My bank account had $1,100 in it. My marriage had a lawyer's letterhead attached to it now. And somewhere across town, in a high-rise near Rittenhouse Square, my wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, was living a life that looked, from the outside, like she'd never lost a single thing. I knew because she made sure I saw it. Every few days a photo would surface. Yetunde at a rooftop bar, champagne flute in hand, laughing with her head tilted back. Yetunde in a red dress at some gallery opening. And standing beside her, more and more often, a man named Montrell Hale. Tailored blazer, gold watch, the kind of smile that photographed well and meant very little. I won't lie to you. There were nights I sat on the edge of that thin mattress, staring at my phone, feeling something ugly and heavy settle in my chest. Not jealousy exactly, something closer to grief. Grief for the version of myself who had spent years believing that quiet devotion was the same thing as being valued. I'd catch myself studying his hands in those photos, soft, uncalloused, the kind of hands that had never carried a 50-pound crate at 5 a.m., and hate myself a little for noticing. It wasn't him I was measuring. It was the 12 years since I'd had hands like that myself, before the warehouse, before the properties, before any of this. I thought about 4 years earlier when my company offered me a promotion, operations lead, a transfer to New York, nearly double my salary. I remember sitting Yetunde down at our kitchen table with the offer letter between us, my hands actually shaking with excitement. She cried that night, not happy tears. She told me she couldn't leave Philadelphia, couldn't leave her friends, her mother, the life she'd spent years building here. She asked me to turn it down. I did. I told my manager no the following Monday, and I never brought it up again. What I never told her, what I never told anyone, was that around that same time, her mother had a minor stroke, and the specialist bills weren't covered by insurance the way the family assumed they would be. I quietly paid down almost $11,000 of those bills over the following 2 years, working every overtime shift the warehouse would give me. Yetunde never knew. I never wanted her to feel like charity in her own family. She used to say I only knew how to work, not how to provide. I let her believe that, too. Some sacrifices, I'd learned, are only real if nobody claps for them. By the 3rd week in that cold little apartment, money had gotten tight enough that I sold my father's old fishing boat, the one thing of his I had left, just to cover rent. I remember watching it get hitched to a stranger's truck and feeling something in my chest go quiet and still, like a door closing softly instead of slamming. But there was one thing Yetunde never found, not in 5 years of marriage, not once. Behind a false panel in the floor of our old garage, the one I'd installed myself over a long weekend 3 years earlier, telling her it was for extra insulation, sat a fireproof lockbox. Inside it, the deed documentation, LLC paperwork, and 5 years of financial statements for a small holding company I had built quietly, one property at a time, under a name she never thought to ask about. Reed Legacy Holdings. It started small. A foreclosed row home in Fishtown I picked up for $18,000 at a sheriff's sale, fixed up on weekends with borrowed tools and YouTube tutorials, and rented out within 4 months. Then a second property. Then a third. By the 5th year, the portfolio had quietly grown to 23 properties scattered across Fishtown and Northern Liberties. Modest row homes, a couple of small multifamily buildings, a handful of storefronts nobody else wanted. Every one of them bought and held under Reed Legacy Holdings, never once mentioned at our dinner table. Every dollar of profit went back into the company. I drove the same 12-year-old truck the entire time. I wore the same 3 work shirts on rotation. I let my wife believe we were a warehouse and hope household, because the moment felt wrong to bring it up. And then another moment came, and another, until 5 years had passed and the secret had simply become part of who I was. I never planned to hide it from her out of malice. In the beginning, I told myself I was waiting for the right time to surprise her. But somewhere along the way, watching her scroll through other people's vacations with a hunger in her eyes that never seemed to be satisfied by anything I could give her, I started to understand something uncomfortable. The right time was never going to come, because Yetunde wasn't looking for a partner to build something with. She was looking for someone to arrive already finished. I wasn't finished. I was still becoming. By the start of my 2nd month in that apartment, my phone rang. DeAndre Washington, my best friend since we were 19 years old, working our first warehouse jobs together, splitting a $2 coffee between us because that's all we could afford. "You sitting down?" he asked. "I'm sitting on a mattress that smells like an old gym bag, DeAndre. What's up?" City Council's about to vote on the Fishtown Northern Liberties infrastructure package. New transit stop, road expansion, the whole thing. My cousin works at the Planning Commission. The vote's set for next month. This hasn't hit the news yet. I sat up slowly. Next month? That's not much time. "It's enough if you move now," DeAndre said. "Once this goes public, property values in a 6-block radius are going to move fast. You've already got parcels sitting right in that zone, and there's 4 more still up for grabs before anybody else figures out what's coming." I looked around the small, cold room. $1,100 in checking. A suitcase still not fully unpacked in the corner. A wife who thought I was a man with nothing left to lose. She was right about one thing. I had nothing left to lose. Which meant, for the first time in 5 years, I had nothing left to protect either. No marriage to shield, no peace to preserve, no reason left to stay small and quiet. DeAndre, I said, I need everything you can get me on those 4 parcels. Zoning, ownership records, asking prices. Tonight if you can. There was a pause on the line, then a low laugh. The kind DeAndre only used when he already knew something was about to change. Man, he said, I've been waiting 5 years for you to finally let yourself go all the way. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long moment, listening to the radiator clank, listening to the rain start up again against that window that never quite closed. Somewhere across the city, Yetunde was probably posting another photo, another rooftop, another glass raised to a life she thought she'd upgraded into. She had no idea that the clock had just started on the final month that would change both our lives forever. Kamani sat on 23 properties and said nothing, while Yetunde told her friends he'd never amount to anything. Team Kamani, his silence was hard-earned self-protection. Team Yetunde, a marriage built on a secret that size was never honest to begin with. Pick your side in the comments, Team Kamani or Team Yetunde. The next 4 weeks moved faster than any stretch of my life before them. I didn't sleep much. I didn't need to. There's a particular kind of energy that comes from a man who has spent 5 years building something in the dark and finally has a reason to bring it into the light. And I was running on every ounce of it. The morning after DeAndre's call, I drove to the small shared office space I'd been quietly renting under Reed Legacy Holdings for the past year. A modest room above a hardware store on Frankfurt Avenue that Yetunde had never once asked about because in her mind, I had nowhere important to be. I spread out 5 years of paperwork across a folding table. Deeds for all 23 properties, rental income statements, the LLC's modest but steadily climbing balance sheet, $240,000 in liquid reserve. Money I'd built one overtime shift, one small rental payment, one disciplined decision at a time, while my wife told her friends I didn't understand ambition. It wasn't enough to buy the 4 new parcels DeAndre had flagged outright, but it was enough to move first. And moving first, I'd learned, mattered more than moving big. I met with a small community bank on Girard Avenue that had financed my first 2 properties years earlier. The loan officer, a woman named Patrice who'd watched me pay every note on time for 3 straight years, didn't blink when I laid out the plan. You want to leverage the existing portfolio to acquire 4 more parcels in a rezoning corridor before the vote goes public, she said, reading my proposal back to me. That's right. That's aggressive, Kamani. I've been patient for 5 years, I told her. I think I've earned aggressive. She approved the line of credit within 4 days. Over the following month, I moved through Fishtown and Northern Liberties like a man finally allowed to run after years of walking carefully. I acquired a shuttered auto shop on Frankfurt Avenue, a row of 4 connected row homes near the future transit stop, and a half-vacant commercial strip that everyone else in the neighborhood assumed was worthless. Nobody knew it was me. I negotiated through Reed Legacy Holdings, LLC, a name that meant nothing to anyone in Philadelphia real estate circles yet, a nobody's name, exactly the way I wanted it. DeAndre came by the office most evenings after his own shift, bringing takeout and staying late to help me comb through contracts. One night, sorting through a stack of closing documents, he looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Something between pride and disbelief. 27 properties, he said, almost to himself, doing the math out loud. 5 years of warehouse wages and rental income, while she called you nothing. She didn't call me nothing, I said quietly. She just never asked. Same thing in a marriage, DeAndre said. I didn't argue with him. On the last week of that month, the Philadelphia City Council formally voted to approve the infrastructure package. A new transit stop, expanded road access, and a mixed-use development zone spanning 6 blocks through Fishtown and into Northern Liberties. Local news ran the story that evening. By the next morning, real estate agents across the city were calling property owners in that corridor, offering numbers that would have sounded absurd a month earlier. I wasn't selling. I was the one who already owned most of the block they were calling about. Within 72 hours of the vote, independent appraisers, the same ones the banks and title companies used for verification, came back with a number for the full, consolidated Reed Legacy Holdings portfolio. Not just the 4 new parcels, all 27 properties. 5 years of quiet accumulation, suddenly sitting inside a corridor the city had just promised to transform. Just over $750 million. Exactly 3 months to the day since I'd stood in the rain outside that house in Mount Airy with one suitcase in my hand. I read the appraisal letter twice, standing alone in that small office above the hardware store, work boots still on, hands still faintly stained from helping DeAndre move filing boxes the night before. For a moment, I let myself picture telling my father, the man who'd taught me to fish off a rented dock in Wildwood, who died before I bought my first property. I wondered if he'd have been proud, or just quietly unsurprised, the way steady men usually are. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I sat down slowly in the folding chair across from the desk and looked out the small window at Frankfort Avenue below. Buses running their routes, a woman walking her dog, a man locking up his corner store for the night. The same ordinary Philadelphia evening it had been an hour earlier. Except now, quietly, invisibly, everything had changed. If I'm honest, the money was never really the point. It was the proof. Somewhere under 5 years of silence was a boy who'd been told quiet men don't amount to much, and every deed in that folder was an argument against that old fear. What scared me most was never losing Yetunde. It was the thought that she might have been right about me all along. Sitting there with that appraisal letter, I finally understood I hadn't built an empire to win her back. I'd built it to stop needing her permission to feel like enough. I thought about the porch in Mount Airy, the rain, the suitcase. 30 minutes to pack a life. I thought about 4 years earlier turning down New York, watching my wife cry with relief that I'd chosen to stay small for her. $750 million didn't feel like luck sitting in that chair. It felt like the compound interest of every night I stayed quiet when I wanted to argue, every extra shift I took instead of resting, every dollar I funneled into a company with my own name in the title instead of spending it on things that would have made my life look impressive to people who were never really watching closely anyway. The rezoning hadn't made me rich. It had simply turned the lights on in a room I'd been quietly furnishing for half a decade. It felt, more than anything, like proof. Quiet, undeniable proof that the years I spent being underestimated were never wasted. They were simply unfinished. My phone buzzed, a text from Abiola, my older sister, the only person besides DeAndre who'd ever known even a fraction of what I was building. Saw the news about the rezoning. You good? I typed back, better than good. Can you talk tonight? There's something I need to tell you. All of it, this time. Her reply came almost instantly. I've been waiting 5 years for this call, little brother. Come by the house. I drove to Abiola's place in Germantown that night and sat at her kitchen table, the same kind of table Yetunde and I once sat at, except this one had felt like home for a very different reason. I told my sister everything, the properties, the LLC, the 5 years of hiding it, not out of deception, but out of a slow, creeping certainty that revealing it too early would only give Yetunde one more thing to manage, one more thing to perform gratitude for without ever actually seeing me. Abiola listened without interrupting, the way she always had since we were kids. When I finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. You know what the hardest part of loving someone quietly is, she said? Everybody around you thinks quiet means empty. They never stop to ask if it might mean full. I sat with that for a long moment. I need to figure out what to do now, I told her. With all of it. The money doesn't feel like the point anymore. No, Abiola agreed. It never was. I left her house a little after midnight and drove back through the city, past Rittenhouse Square, past the high-rise where I knew Yetunde was probably still awake, probably still scrolling, probably still telling herself a story about a man who never amounted to anything. She had no idea the story had already changed. She had no idea that the very next morning she was going to wake up to a set of headlines she would never see coming. Headlines with my name in them, tied to a portfolio worth $750 million, filed under a company she had lived beside for 5 years and never once thought to ask about. She threw away a man she thought had nothing, but what she's about to find out will make her question everything she thought she understood about the marriage she walked away from. The story broke the very next morning, exactly the way I knew it would. A short business feature in a local Philadelphia real estate publication. The kind of article that normally gets read by a few hundred people and forgotten by lunchtime. This one didn't get forgotten. Unknown investor behind Fishtown Northern Liberty's land grab revealed. Reed Legacy Holdings, led by Philadelphia native Kimani Reed, now holds portfolio valued near $750 million. By that afternoon, it had been picked up by 2 larger outlets. By evening, it was circulating through group chats and social feeds across the city. The kind of local story that feels almost like folklore. The quiet warehouse worker nobody had heard of, sitting on $750 million in prime real estate. I found out Yetunde had seen it because she called me 4 times in a row before I finally picked up. Kimani? Her voice was different than I remembered, softer at the edges but shaking underneath, like a woman standing on ice she wasn't sure would hold. Is this real? Is this article about you? It's real, I said simply. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear her breathing change. I need to see you, she said. Please, just talk to me. I agreed to meet her, not because I owed her anything, but because some conversations need a room and a face, not a phone line. And because, if I'm honest, some part of me needed to close this chapter properly, with my own eyes open the whole time. She came to my new office in Center City 2 days later. A real office now, 12 floors up, glass walls looking out over the skyline she used to dream about from our old porch in Mount Airy. She walked in wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, her hands trembling slightly as she sat down across from my desk. I made a mistake, she said, before I could speak. Montrell, he wasn't who I thought he was. He's been asking me things, Kimani, about your business dealings, your old properties, your relationships with people at your former job. It felt strange, but I didn't understand why until I saw the article. I think he was only ever with me to try to get close to you, or to information about you. I didn't know any of this. I swear I didn't know. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt. 5 years of marriage had taught me the value of listening all the way to the end before responding. Then I opened my laptop. Before you say anything else, I said quietly, I need to show you something. I turned the screen toward her. Photographs, text message screenshots, time-stamped from 14 months before our divorce. A hotel receipt from a boutique property near Old City, dated the weekend she told me she was visiting her cousin in Baltimore. Yetunde went very still. The only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC and a siren fading somewhere below on Broad Street. I watched her throat move as she swallowed, watched her sleeve tremble slightly against the desk. Small tells I'd learned to read in boardrooms, now turned, without pleasure, on her. I've known for over a year, I said, before the divorce. Before any of it. Her face drained of color. You knew? This whole time? Why didn't you say something? Because I needed the divorce to happen exactly the way it happened, I said, keeping my voice level, calm. The same voice I'd used my entire life to keep from raising it. I needed you to be the one who ended it. I needed you to take the house, the furniture, everything visible. Because the moment you thought you'd won something, you stopped looking for anything else. Our divorce went through as a simple, uncontested settlement. You wanted out, I signed everything without a fight, and both our attorneys filed a standard agreement with a mutual release. Nobody ever asked for a forensic accountant, because nobody had a reason to suspect there was anything left to find. Watching her face fall apart across that desk, I realized my calm wasn't coldness. It was the only kind of control I'd ever let myself have in that marriage. I'd spent years afraid that showing my hurt out loud would just give her one more reason to see me as less. So I'd learned to carry it silently instead, and silence had become both my armor and my prison. Revealing the truth now wasn't about revenge. It was about finally being known, even by someone already walking out the door. Some part of me had waited a year for this exact moment, not to hurt her, but to stop being the only one who understood the whole story. Reed Legacy Holdings, I continued. You never asked what it was. Not once in 5 years, even though the paperwork sat behind a false panel in our own garage. If you'd suspected there was real money involved, your lawyer would have gone digging. Instead, you took the house and walked away satisfied. And I kept every dollar of the company you never knew existed. You let me leave you, she whispered. I let you believe you were leaving a man with nothing, I said. That's not the same thing as being weak, Yetunde. That was the only way to protect 5 years of work from becoming a bargaining chip in a courtroom. She sat back in the chair, one hand pressed against her mouth, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Then I opened a second folder. There's something else you should see. Inside were 3 years of medical payment records, the specialist bills for her mother's stroke recovery, quietly paid down in installments I'd made under a private arrangement with the hospital's billing office, never once mentioned to Yetunde or her family. Alongside them, receipts for 2 semesters of tuition I'd covered for Abiola's oldest daughter, my niece, money Yetunde had once complained I never had enough of for our own household. You used to tell your friends I'd never be more than a warehouse paycheck, I said quietly. I want you to understand something clearly, right now, sitting in this office. Every dollar I made in those years went somewhere. It went to my wife's mother's recovery. It went to my niece's education. It went into a company that would eventually be worth $750 million. I never stopped providing. I stopped explaining myself because you'd already decided who I was, and no explanation was ever going to change your mind. Tears were falling freely down her face now, but I felt strangely calm watching them. Not cruel, not triumphant, just calm. The way you feel standing on solid ground after years of walking on something that could give way at any moment. I don't know what to say, she finally managed. You don't have to say anything, I told her. I'm not asking you to. I just needed you to understand, clearly, one time, that the man you kicked out into the rain wasn't the man you thought he was. He never was. You just never asked the right questions. She reached for my hand across the desk. I gently pulled it back, not with anger, but with a quiet finality that seemed to land harder than any raised voice ever could have. I appreciate you coming to tell me about Montreal, I said. I already knew. DeAndre's been tracking his business dealings for weeks. He's been quietly trying to leverage a connection at my former employer to interfere with 2 of my active projects. That ends today, too. Yetunde stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, looking at me the way you look at a stranger who used to live in your house. I really did love you, Kimani, she said softly at the door. I know, I said. That was never the problem. The problem was you loved a version of me you thought needed less than I actually deserved. She left without another word. The glass door clicked shut behind her, softer than that deadbolt in Mount Airy had once sounded, but somehow just as final. I sat alone in my office as the afternoon light shifted across the Philadelphia skyline, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in the room didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I had finally earned. She thought she was the one walking away with everything, but the truth was, she never even knew what she was standing next to. What comes next is the part of the story that finally sets everything right. 2 months after that conversation in my Center City office, I stood on the front steps of a house I knew better than almost any place on earth. The old 2-story on that same street in Mount Airy, though not the one Yetunde had kept in the divorce. This one belonged to my grandmother when I was a boy, before it passed out of the family during a hard stretch years ago. I bought it back, quietly, the same way I'd built everything else, and turned it into something new. A brass plaque by the front door read, Reed Legacy Foundation. Inside, the rooms that once held my grandmother's Sunday dinners now held desks, filing cabinets, and a small conference room where, twice a week, families from North Philadelphia came in to apply for housing assistance, down payment support, emergency rent relief, first-time homeowner grants for working families who'd spent years being told, the way I once had, that they'd never amount to owning anything of their own. DeAndre ran operations for the foundation now, having left his warehouse job the same month I offered him a real position, not out of charity, but because there was no one alive I trusted more with the details of a life built the hard way. You know, he said one afternoon, watching a young father sign paperwork for his first home loan in the next room, 5 years ago, you and me were splitting a $2 coffee because that's all we had between us. I remember, I said. Feels like a long way from a garage floor panel. I laughed, quietly, for the first time in longer than I could remember laughing about any of it. There had been complications along the way, of course. Montrell Hale's attempt to use information from Yetunde to interfere with 2 of my active development projects had nearly worked. He'd partnered with a disgruntled former colleague of mine to try to delay permits on the Northern Liberties property, hoping to force a distressed sale he could scoop up cheap. DeAndre caught it 3 weeks before it would have cost me the project entirely, and once the paperwork trail became clear, the whole scheme collapsed under its own weight. Montrell disappeared from Philadelphia business circles not long after. I never heard from him again, and I never needed to. The $750 million portfolio I'd built over 5 years and revealed almost overnight didn't stay locked away in spreadsheets and appraisal letters. I put it to work, real work, meeting with contractors on job sites in work boots instead of a suit, sitting across tables from architects who understood that a building was only as good as the community it stood in. That's how I met Ayodele Thompson. She was the architect the city recommended when Reed Legacy Holdings began developing affordable housing units across the Fishtown and Northern Liberties corridor, the same 6 blocks that had once made me $750 million almost overnight, now being reshaped into something that would outlast the headlines that made me famous for a season. Ayodele didn't know who I was when we first met. Not really. She knew I owned the company. She didn't know the story behind it, the porch in the rain, the years of silence, the marriage that had taught me the difference between being loved and being seen. She simply looked at my early sketches for the development. Modest, human-scaled buildings, courtyards instead of parking lots, ground floor space set aside for a community center, and said, "Whoever designed the priorities behind this understands something most developers never bother to learn." "What's that?" I asked. "That people don't just need shelter," she said. "They need to be trusted enough to build a life inside it." I didn't say much in response. I just nodded and something in my chest, quiet for a long time, loosened slightly. It was such a small thing to notice, and yet I noticed it the way I used to notice every crack in a foundation before I bid on a property. Quietly, thoroughly, already imagining what could be built there. We worked together for the better part of 2 months on that first project. Long meetings that ran late into the evening, disagreements over floor plans that somehow never turned into arguments. A kind of easy respect I hadn't felt with another person in longer than I wanted to admit. I wasn't in any hurry to name what was growing between us. After everything, I'd learned the value of letting something prove itself slowly, instead of needing it to be certain right away. By the end of that second month, the first building in the development was fully leased, half of it to families who'd come through the Reed Legacy Foundation's assistance program. I stood at the ribbon cutting on a cold, clear morning, watching an older woman from North Philadelphia hold her new set of keys against her chest like they were something sacred.
She caught my eye across the small crowd and walked over.
"They tell me you grew up not far from here," she said. "Not far at all," I said. "Then you understand," she said simply, and squeezed my hand before walking away toward her new front door. I stood there for a long moment on the sidewalk, work boots on solid ground, watching families move boxes into homes that existed because of choices I'd made in silence, years before anyone believed I was capable of making them. I thought about the man who stood in the rain in Mount Airy with one suitcase and nowhere to go. He had no idea, standing there, that he wasn't losing his life that night. He was finally putting it down long enough to build the real one. A man who spent 5 years being overlooked had just spent 2 months proving exactly what quiet strength was capable of building. But the most important part of his story was still waiting to unfold. 6 months after that night in the rain, I stood on the rooftop terrace of the newest Reed Legacy Holdings building in Fishtown, watching the sun go down over a Philadelphia skyline I'd once only looked at from a folding chair in a rented office above a hardware store. Iodele stood beside me, a rolled set of blueprints tucked under one arm, having just finished walking city officials through the foundation's third completed housing project. Below us, the streets that had once been quiet, overlooked corners of the city were full of light, porch lamps, kitchen windows, the small, ordinary glow of families settling into homes they now called their own. "You've gone quiet," she said, glancing over at me. "Just thinking," I said. "About?" I considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. "About how close I came to staying small forever," I said. "If Yetunde hadn't kicked me out that night, I don't know if I ever would have let myself finish what I started. I might have spent another 5 years hiding all of it, waiting for a moment that felt safe enough." Ayodele was quiet for a moment, watching the last light catch the windows of the building across from us. "Sometimes," she finally said, "the person who hurts us the most ends up doing the one thing we could never do for ourselves. They force the door open." I thought about that for a long time after she said it. Because here's the truth I've come to understand, standing on rooftops that didn't exist a year ago, looking out over a life I built twice, once in silence and once in the open. My wife never destroyed me the night she locked that door behind me. She simply revealed how much of myself I'd been keeping locked away too. Out of fear, out of habit, out of a quiet belief that my worth was something I had to earn permission to claim. I think about her sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of distant understanding. I heard, through people who still move in those circles, that she left Philadelphia not long after our last conversation. I don't know where she landed, and I've stopped needing to know. Some chapters close cleanly, without a final scene, and that's allowed to be enough. What I do know is this: the years I spent as her quietly disappointing husband were never wasted years. Every overtime shift, every dollar hidden away instead of spent, every night I stayed calm instead of raising my voice, all of it became the foundation of something that would eventually outlast the marriage itself. The Reed Legacy Foundation now operates in 4 Philadelphia neighborhoods. Abiola sits on the board. DeAndre runs day-to-day operations with the same steady loyalty he's shown me since we were 19 years old, splitting a $2 coffee. And Ayodele? Well, Ayodele has slowly, patiently become someone I no longer think about losing. Because for the first time in my life, I'm building something with a person who sees the whole of me, not just the parts that were convenient. I don't share this story to make anyone feel triumphant over someone else's pain. I share it because I know there are people watching tonight, sitting in a quiet kitchen somewhere, or in a recliner with a cup of coffee going cold, or on a porch that's been creaking since long before anyone thought to fix it, who have spent years being told, in ways loud or quiet, that they don't measure up, that their sacrifices don't count because no one saw them happen. I want you to hear this clearly. They count. Every single one. This story reminds us that quiet devotion is never proof of weakness. It's proof of a heart still working long after it stopped being thanked. If you're sitting with a marriage that ended, or a husband whose chair at the table sits empty now, don't wait for some grand gesture to feel whole again. Keep his old flannel shirt on the hook by the back door, and some Saturday mornings, put it on and wear it out to the garden anyway, just to feel useful in it again. Call your sister or your best friend from church every Sunday at 4 o'clock, before the evening gets long and quiet. Write down one thing he did right in the notebook by your recliner, even on the nights you're still angry. Legacy was never the money left behind. It's the people who still feel steadier years later because you loved them out loud, even when you had to do it in silence. If this story moved you tonight, I hope you'll carry a piece of it with you, into your own kitchen, your own porch, your own quiet moments of doubt. Because somewhere out there, someone is still standing in the rain, wondering if their sacrifices will ever be seen. They will be. Sometimes it just takes a little longer than we'd like. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next story. Human writers poured their soul into these scripts to expose injustice and celebrate humanity. AI served as a technical supporter, refining expression so the valuable messages of equality, humility, and hope could reach and inspire millions. Production team story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Wynn. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Wynn. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.